She had refilled that man's coffee 4 times without making eye contact once. That was how Olivia Mercer survived, by being invisible, by moving fast enough that no one looked too long, by keeping her voice just pleasant enough that no one remembered it later. 3 years in Mill Haven, 3 years behind the counter at Kettle and Creek Diner, and she had perfected the art of existing without being seen. Then the dog walked across the room and pressed his nose against her thigh, and everything she had built came apart in under a minute. Nobody moved. The breakfast crowd, ranchers, retirees, the occasional trucker passing through, froze mid-bite. Marcus Hale sat in the corner booth he always took, the one with the view of the door, and stared at his service dog like the animal had grown a second head. Bear was a Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, 72 pounds of muscle and discipline. He had been trained by people Olivia would never name out loud. He did not approach strangers. He did not leave Marcus's side without a command. He was pressed against Olivia's leg, shaking slightly, and she wasn't breathing. Her hand dropped to his head without thinking. Her fingers found the scar behind his left ear. The old one, raised and thick, shaped like a crescent, and she stopped moving entirely. The coffee pot hung in her hand. Her knuckles went white around the handle. Bear. Marcus's voice was low and careful. The dog didn't move. Bear, heel. Nothing. Olivia's eyes were somewhere else. Her face had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. Ma'am. Marcus was getting up from the booth now, moving the way men move when they're trying not to alarm anyone, slow and deliberate. I don't know what's gotten into him. He's not supposed to do that. Olivia pulled her hand back. She stepped away from the dog. She forced her face back into the expression she wore every day. Pleasant, empty, forgettable. He's fine, she said. Can I get you a refill on that coffee? Before we go any further, if you're new here, I want you to stay. This story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. Hit follow so you don't lose it. And when you're done watching, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Mill Haven, Montana sat at the bottom of a valley that the rest of the country had mostly forgotten. Population 1,100, 1 stoplight, 2 bars, and a diner that had been open since 1974. The mountains were real. The winters were brutal. The people had a way of leaving each other alone that Olivia had come to depend on like oxygen. She had rented the studio above the hardware store on Larimer Street 37 months ago, paid cash for the first 2 months, and asked no questions about the place's history. The landlord, a man named Gus, who was closing in on 70 and had no interest in conversation, asked no questions about hers. The arrangement suited them both. She had found the waitress job inside a week. Patsy, who owned Kettle and Creek and ran it with the grim efficiency of someone who had survived multiple things she didn't discuss, had looked at Olivia for about 4 seconds and said, "You work weekends?" "Yes." "You show up on time?" "Yes." "Don't need to know anything else." That was the entirety of the hiring process. Olivia had almost liked Patsy for it. She learned the regulars quickly, not because she was warm, but because tracking people was a habit she couldn't shake. Marcus Hale came in Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, always ordered black coffee and the short stack, always sat in the corner booth, always had Bear lying under the table. He'd been coming in since before Olivia arrived, according to Patsy. Former Navy, someone had mentioned once. Patsy had given that person a look that suggested the observation was unnecessary, and no one brought it up again. Olivia had kept her distance from Marcus the same way she kept her distance from anything that might pull at something she'd buried. She refilled his coffee. She left his check. She did not make small talk. Bear had ignored her for 3 years the same way she'd ignored him. That was the part that made this morning feel like the floor dropping out. She went back to the counter. She poured someone else's coffee. She heard Marcus settle back into the booth and the low command he gave Bear in a tone she recognized. The one that wasn't quite a reprimand, more like a reset. The dog complied. The diner resumed its low hum. Olivia did not look back. She lasted 40 minutes before she took her break in the alley behind the kitchen, sat on an overturned milk crate in the October cold, and pressed both hands flat against her thighs until they stopped shaking. The scar behind Bear's ear. She knew that scar. She had made it. Not the wound itself, but the sutures. Interrupted pattern, because she'd been running low on materials and needed each one to hold. She had used a penlight gripped between her teeth. She had been lying on her stomach in the dark with her boots in 2 inches of standing water and something burning about 60 meters north of her position, and she had kept her hand steady enough to close a 5 centimeter laceration on a dog she had never met before that night, and would, she had believed until 40 minutes ago, never see again. She hadn't known his name then. She hadn't known anything about him except that he was still breathing, and the soldier who'd brought him to her had said, "Please," just that one word, nothing else. And she had worked. That was 6 years ago, outside Kandahar. A mission that officially did not exist on any record she had ever been permitted to see. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth and stared at the dumpster. The dog's name had been Atlas. She made it through the rest of her shift by not thinking about it. This was a skill she had developed over years, and she was good at it, the same way she was good at most things she had needed to survive. Not through grace, but through stubborn, repetitive practice. She cleared tables. She ran the credit card machine. She said, "You're welcome," 14 times. Marcus Hale was gone by 9:30. Bear walked out beside him, precise and calm, and didn't look back at her. Olivia watched them through the window above the dish station and felt something she couldn't name sit heavy in her chest. She had 2 more hours on her shift. She worked them. She went home, changed out of her uniform, and took the long way to the grocery store because it went past the river, and the noise of the water helped sometimes when her thoughts got loud. She had been in Millhaven long enough that the cashier at the grocery store knew she bought the same 6 things every week. She had been here long enough that the man who ran the hardware store downstairs left her alone, and the woman at the post office knew her name. She had been here long enough that she had started to believe this was possible, this quiet, ordinary life, this invisibility. 1 dog, 3 seconds, a crescent-shaped scar. She bought her groceries. She walked home. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at her hands. Tuesday, she called in sick. She never called in sick. Patsy answered the phone with the kind of silence that communicated clearly that this was inconvenient and that Olivia would owe her, and then said fine and hung up. No questions. That was still the arrangement. Olivia spent the morning trying to talk herself into reasonableness. Maybe she was wrong about the scar. It had been 6 years. She had been operating in low light under active fire with her hands wrist deep in a dog's neck, and her own adrenaline at a level where fine motor perception was compromised. She had been exhausted, afraid, running on 3 hours of sleep and a cold MRE. Memory was not a reliable instrument under those conditions. She knew this. She had been told this by people far more qualified than her. The scar was a specific shape, her own mind said back, flat and certain. 5 centimeters. Interrupted suture. Crescent curve because the laceration tracked along the jaw muscle. You tied off each stitch individually because you were afraid the thread would break and you needed redundancy. You remember exactly. She went for a run at noon and pushed herself harder than usual until her lungs burned and her legs ached, and there was no room in her head for anything except the mechanics of movement. It didn't work. By Thursday, she was back at the diner because she couldn't afford to lose the shifts. She came in early to stock the condiment trays and told herself she was fine. Marcus Hale arrived at 7:53, same as always. Bear walked in at his left side and went under the table. Olivia brought coffee from across the room without being asked, because that was also the same as always, and set the mug down without looking at the dog. "Thank you," Marcus said. "Yep." She started to turn. "Can I ask you something?" She stopped, kept her back to him for 1 second, then turned. He was looking at her the way she'd noticed men with combat experience sometimes looked at things they were trying to figure out. Not aggressive, just patient and very specific. "Okay," she said. "What you did on Saturday? With Bear?" He paused. "You went somewhere. I've seen that look before. I've had it myself." "I don't know what you mean." "Yeah, you do." He said it without aggression, not an accusation, an observation. He's not supposed to respond to people he doesn't know. He's never done that before. I've been trying to work out why, and the only answer I keep landing on is that he does know you. He let that sit for a moment. "Which doesn't make sense to me. But here we are." Olivia looked at the mug she'd set on the table. The coffee was still settling. "I have other tables," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "Take your time." She thought about quitting. She did the math. She had enough saved to cover rent for 3 months if she was careful, Enough to get to another town and start over somewhere smaller, though she wasn't sure there was anywhere much smaller than Millhaven. She had done this calculation before, in 2 other places, and each time she had decided against it because running had costs that didn't show up in the math. She did not quit. On Saturday, she came in and Marcus Hale was in his booth and she brought his coffee, and he said nothing about Tuesday, and she said nothing about anything. Bear lay under the table with his chin on his paws and did not look at her. She was almost through it. She was almost past the danger point. Then a man she didn't recognize came through the door, mid-40s, wearing a vest that said Veteran Wellness Network in small letters on the chest, and sat down at the counter and started talking to Patsy, and the words that drifted over were Marcus Hale, coming out to the center next weekend, and we're doing a training demonstration with service dogs. Olivia refilled the sugar dispensers and told herself this was not her business. They're looking for a vet tech volunteer, she heard the man say, or anyone with medical background who wants to help out. Patsy made a non-committal sound that meant talk to someone else. The man turned on his stool and looked down the counter. His eyes passed over Olivia. You wouldn't happen to have any medical training, would you? No, she said. He nodded and turned back to Patsy. From the corner booth, she felt Marcus Hale not looking at her. She made herself go home that afternoon without incident. She made dinner, rice, canned black beans, a fried egg on top because she'd run out of other ideas, and ate it standing at the counter because she still hadn't decided whether she lived here permanently or just temporarily, even after 37 months, and sitting at the table still sometimes felt presumptuous. She was washing her single dish when she heard the door knock. She stood still for a moment. Nobody knocked on her door. Gus had stopped coming up for anything after the first month, and she had no friends in Millhaven in any meaningful sense, just people she recognized and people who recognized her. She opened this door. Marcus Hale stood in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets and Bear sitting at his left side. He didn't look surprised to be there, which meant he'd found her address and thought about whether to use it before deciding. Before you say anything, he said, I want to be clear that I'm not here to push you. I needed to check something. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone. He pulled up a photograph and held it out to her. She took the phone because her hands moved before her mind caught up. It was a photograph she had never seen. It must have come from someone's camera that night, someone's equipment feed, some record she'd never been given access to. It was dark and grainy and shot from above, some kind of overhead footage, and it showed a figure she recognized as herself. She recognized the set of her own shoulders, the way she held her elbows when she was working, crouched over a dog in what looked like rubble. Behind her, smoke. In front of her, nothing but the animal on the ground and her own hands moving. She stood there holding Marcus Hale's phone in her kitchen doorway and didn't say anything for a long time. His name was Atlas, Marcus said quietly. He was my unit's dog. We lost him on an extraction in 18, and I spent a long time thinking I'd never know what happened to him after the mission went bad. He paused. A buddy of mine doing archival work found this footage 6 months ago. He showed it to me trying to help me get some closure. Olivia was still looking at the photo. The figure on the ground. Her own hands. The dog. The problem, Marcus said, is that the person in that footage was never identified. Whoever she wasn't on the official roster for that mission. She was either a ghost, or she was someone who wasn't supposed to be there, or she was someone who got very deliberately removed from the record afterward. He paused again. But I've been sitting across from her in a diner for 3 years. Olivia handed his phone back. She looked at the wall behind him instead of at him. You should go, she said. I know. I'm going. He took the phone, tucked it away. I'm not asking you to tell me anything tonight. I'm not asking you anything. He looked at her for a moment with that same patient, specific look. I just needed you to know that I know. That somebody finally knows. He turned to leave, then stopped. Atlas is alive, by the way. He retired from service in 2020. I was able to track him down through a buddy. He's been with me for a 1.5 years. He glanced down at Bear. He told me to name him something different for the transition. She looked at the dog. Bear looked back at her with calm, dark eyes and the faint ridge of scar tissue behind his left ear. Get some sleep, Marcus said. I'll see you Tuesday. He went down the stairs. She heard the outer door open and close. Olivia stood in her kitchen doorway in the dark for a long time after that, And the only sound was the river she couldn't quite hear from this side of town, and the low noise of her own breathing, and the name she had spent 6 years not saying finally surfaced. The one she had locked down beneath everything else, beneath the apron, and the silence, and 37 months of Millhaven mornings. Ray. She pressed her back against the doorframe. There had been 2 of them she was trying to save that night. The dog had made it. The dog was standing at the bottom of her stairs right now, alive and whole, and answering to a different name. 6 years later, his scar healed smooth except where her sutures had pulled just slightly uneven in the dark. The soldier hadn't made it. And somewhere out there was a family that still didn't know what really happened, who had really stayed, who had really tried, what the last hour had actually looked like on the ground before everything went silent, and the record was written by people who hadn't been there. Olivia slid down the doorframe until she was sitting on the floor. Her hands were shaking again, and this time she didn't try to make them stop. Tuesday morning, before the diner opened, she was already there. She got there at 5:40, before Patsy arrived, before anyone arrived, and she sat in the parking lot in her car for 20 minutes doing nothing. When she finally went inside and started the coffee and began setting up the condiment trays, she worked steadily and without drama, the same as always. The same routine, the same movements. But something had shifted, something in the air pressure of her own interior life. Some sealed compartment that had been airtight for 6 years had developed a hairline crack. She heard Patsy's truck pull in. She heard the back door open. "You're early," Patsy said, which was not a question. "Couldn't sleep." Patsy hung her coat and started on the biscuits, and that was the end of it. The diner filled up at 7. By 8, Marcus Hale was in his corner booth with his black coffee and his dog. He nodded at Olivia when she brought the mug. She nodded back. She was halfway back to the counter when she stopped. She turned around. "His name before," she said. She kept her voice low, steady. "The one you gave him when you first got him. Was it Marcus's choice, or did someone from the unit suggest it?" Marcus looked at her. Something careful moved behind his eyes. "It was a suggestion," he said, "from a medic who treated him. There was a name written on the inside cover of the field medical kit she left behind at the site." He paused. "Ray. She wrote the name Ray on the inside cover." Olivia nodded once. Very small. She went back to the counter. Her shift had 4 hours left. She worked them all. But by the time she walked out into the October afternoon, she knew she was done running. Not because she was ready, and not because she wasn't still frightened, but because the dog had found her and the photograph existed and the name was already out in the open now, written on the inside cover of a field kit she had left behind 6 years ago in the dark outside Kandahar. The crack was already there. Sooner or later, the sealed compartment was going to open. The crack didn't widen all at once. That was the thing about compartments built under pressure. They didn't fail dramatically. They leaked. Small things first. A detail surfacing in the middle of a lunch rush. A muscle memory triggered by the wrong angle of afternoon light through the diner window. Olivia would be in the middle of carrying a tray or punching an order into the ancient register, and something would slip through. The smell of burning diesel, the specific weight of a medical kit on her back, the sound Ray Dawson used to make when he laughed at something that wasn't funny, which was most things, which was how he got through the parts that weren't survivable any other way. She managed it. She always managed it. That was not the same thing as being fine, but she had stopped requiring fine a long time ago. Marcus came in Tuesday and Thursday as usual. He didn't push her. He drank his coffee and read something on his phone, and occasionally exchanged a few words with old Dale Pritchett, who sat at the counter every morning and had opinions about everything. Bear lay under the table with the patience of an animal that had learned to wait for things. Olivia refilled Marcus's mug when it needed it, and they didn't speak about anything that mattered, and she told herself this was sustainable. It was sustainable for 11 days. Then Marcus's phone rang during his Thursday morning coffee, and he answered it, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, a stillness that replaced the ordinary relaxed quiet he usually carried. And he said, "When did they contact you?" And then, No, don't say anything yet. I need to make a call first." He hung up. He looked at Olivia, who was pretending to restock the napkin holders 3 tables away. "That was my buddy," he said. "The one who found the footage." She kept her hands on the napkin holder. "Someone else has been asking about it," Marcus said. "A journalist, military background, does long-form pieces for a veteran publication. She's been looking into unaccounted personnel from that operation for about 8 months, and she's gotten close enough that she's starting to name people. Olivia set down the napkins. How close? Close enough to have found the field kit. The field kit. The one she'd left behind. The one with Ray's name written in permanent marker on the inside cover because she'd borrowed it from his pack when hers got damaged crossing the drainage channel, and she'd meant to give it back. And then there was no giving it back. She hasn't published yet, Marcus said, but she's planning to. My buddy thinks within the month. Olivia looked at the table, the coffee mug, the ordinary surface of a Thursday morning. That's not my story to tell, she said, or hers. I know. There are people who made specific decisions about what went into the record and what didn't. If someone starts pulling on that thread, I know, Marcus said again. He wasn't arguing with her. He wasn't telling her what to do. I was just giving her the information, which was its own kind of pressure, the kind that didn't leave marks. She picked the napkins back up. She finished the holder. She moved to the next table. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it for 4 days. She ran further than usual, slept less than usual, ate standing at her counter and stared at the wall, and had arguments with herself that she always lost because both sides of the argument were her. On one side, she had made a life here. Small and stripped down and not what she'd imagined at 22 when she enlisted, but real. Functional. The kind of quiet that took years to build and could be taken apart in a news cycle. On the other side, Ray Dawson's family didn't know. She had looked them up once, 2 years after she left the service. She hadn't planned to. She just found herself at a library computer at 11 o'clock at night in a town 3 states away, typing his name. And the results had come back, and she had read them and then closed the browser and walked back to her car and sat in the parking lot for an hour. His wife's name was Sandra. They had a daughter, Macy, who would be 8 now. Ray's mother was still alive, living in Ardmore, Oklahoma. There had been a memorial piece in the local paper about a year after his death, the kind small papers run for local soldiers. A photograph of him in dress uniform, a quote from his mother about how he always wanted to serve, a line about the family requesting privacy. Nothing about what happened, nothing about what the last hour looked like, nothing about the dog he'd loved and the medic who'd stayed and the field kit that ended up left behind in the rubble with a dead man's name on it. They had a piece of the story. They didn't have the piece that might have helped. Olivia had no way of knowing if it would help. She had no way of knowing if anything she could tell them would do anything except reopen something that had been sealed with official language and military silence, and if that was worse or better than the version they currently had. She didn't know. She went back to the diner on Tuesday. She brought Marcus his coffee. She stood next to his table for a moment. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to be honest with me, even if you think the honest answer is going to be hard to hear. Okay? Ray Dawson's family. Do they know about the dog? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Bear shifted under the table. They know he had a dog, Marcus said carefully. They know Atlas was part of the unit. They don't know what happened to him after the mission. The official summary didn't include it. Do they know he made it? No. Olivia nodded. Something in her chest did something complicated. Who would I talk to, she said, if I wanted to reach out to them? Through the right channel, not through a journalist. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his coffee mug, thought about it, set it back down. I know someone at a veteran family liaison organization, he said. She handles exactly this kind of situation, connecting families with information that got lost in the official process. He paused. She's careful. She's not going to turn it into anything you don't want it to be. I'm not agreeing to anything yet. I know. I'm just asking. I know that too. He reached into his jacket and came out with a business card, which he set on the table beside his mug. Her name's Dora Winslow. She's out of Billings. You don't have to use it. Olivia picked up the card, held it. The cardstock was slightly bent at one corner, like it had been in his pocket for a while. Like maybe he'd been waiting for her to ask. She tucked it into her apron pocket without saying anything else, and went back to work. She called Dora Winslow from her car, parked outside the grocery store at 7 in the evening with the engine running for heat. She had the card in her left hand and her phone in her right, and she dialed the number before she could think about it long enough to stop. A woman answered on the third ring. Direct, unhurried, no nonsense in the way of people who had fielded a lot of difficult calls and had stopped wasting time on preamble. Winslow. My name is Olivia Mercer, Olivia said. Marcus Hale gave me your number. I may have information relevant to a family, a military family. It's complicated and I don't know how to start, so I'm just going to say the name and you can tell me if you can help. Go ahead. Ray Dawson. He died in 2018. His family is in Ardmore, Oklahoma. A brief pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't know the name, the pause of someone who did. I know the Dawson family, Dora said. I've been in contact with Sandra Dawson twice in the last 3 years. She's been trying to get more information about the circumstances of Ray's death. The official record is thin. I know why it's thin. Another pause. Longer. How do you know? Because I was there, Olivia said. I was the last person with him, and I'm the reason his dog is still alive. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Then Dora Winslow said very quietly, Can you come to Billings? She drove to Billings on a Saturday, which was her day off. 4 hours each way on roads that were fine until they weren't, through country that was beautiful in the abstract and relentless up close. She had told Patsy she had an appointment, which was true. She had not told Patsy anything else, which was also fine. Dora Winslow's office was a 2-room suite above a hardware store. Olivia noticed the parallel without amusement, with a waiting area that had comfortable chairs and a table with water and a box of tissues that had the deliberate placement of something that got used regularly. Dora herself was 60-something, compact, with the kind of white hair that looked intentional rather than resigned and eyes that missed very little. She had coffee ready. She didn't make a production of it. They sat at a small table and Olivia talked for 2 hours. She hadn't planned to talk that long. She'd planned to give the essential information, the medical facts, the timeline, what she'd done, and what she hadn't been able to do, and leave the rest alone. But Dora asked questions that were specific without being intrusive, and she listened with a quality of attention that Olivia hadn't encountered in years, and things came out that she hadn't planned to say. She talked about the mission briefing that went wrong at the 3rd checkpoint. She talked about the extraction route that wasn't there anymore by the time they reached it. She talked about Ray Dawson, who had been one of those people who became calm under pressure in a way that was almost eerie, except that she'd understood it because she had the same thing. Not bravery, just a kind of focused narrowing that shut out everything except the immediate problem. She talked about Atlas, who had been injured early and who Ray had carried through 300 meters of compromised terrain rather than leave behind. She talked about the moment it became clear that Ray wasn't going to make it out with her. She talked about what he said, which she had not repeated to another human being in 6 years. She talked until there was nothing left to say. Dora had not taken notes. She had listened. Thank you, she said when Olivia stopped. I don't know if it helps them. I don't know either yet, Dora said, but Sandra Dawson has been living with an incomplete story for 6 years. Whether or not the information changes anything practically, she deserves to have the full picture. She paused. She also deserves to know that her husband wasn't alone. Olivia looked at the table. He wasn't, she said. He wasn't alone. Dora contacted Sandra Dawson, and Sandra Dawson called Olivia's cell number 3 days later at 6:15 in the morning. Olivia was already awake. She was always already awake by 6, and she stared at the unknown number for 2 rings before she answered. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and Olivia cried twice, which she hadn't done in long enough that it surprised her, and Sandra cried more than twice. And there were silences between them that weren't uncomfortable because they were both people who understood that some things didn't have words that fit. Sandra said, at one point, I always felt like we only got the version they decided to give us. You did, Olivia said. And I'm sorry. I should have found a way to tell you sooner. I convinced myself it would make things worse. I understand that, Sandra said. I do. But I need you to know, hearing that he stayed with Atlas, that he didn't just, that he was trying to protect something he loved right up until he couldn't, her voice broke and came back. That's Ray. That's exactly who he was. And I didn't have that. I just had the official letter. Olivia pressed her free hand flat against the kitchen counter. He talked about Macy, she said. He showed me a picture he kept in his kit. She was about 2 in the photo. He said she had his laugh. Sandra made a sound on the phone that was not quite a word. Then she said, she does. She really does. After they hung up, Olivia stood in her kitchen for a long time. The apartment looked the same as always, sparse, functional, the bed visible through the door she'd never bothered to hang properly, the single chair at the table, the counter without anything decorative on it. Ze became aware, for the first time in 37 months, that it looked like a place someone was staying temporarily. She didn't tell Marcus how the call went, not in detail. She told him it happened, that Sandra Dawson had reached out, that the conversation was hard and necessary, and she was glad it occurred. Marcus nodded and didn't ask for more. Bear put his head against her knee while she stood next to the booth talking, which was the second time he'd done that, and which she was choosing not to examine too closely. "There's something else," Marcus said. She waited. "The journalist. The one who's been working on the piece about unaccounted personnel." He set his coffee down. "She reached out to me yesterday. She's tracked Atlas through the service dog registry. She knows he's with me, and she knows about the field kit. What does she want?" "She wants to know who wrote the name on the inside cover." He paused. "She already has enough to publish something. It won't name you. She doesn't have your name yet. But it'll describe the situation in enough detail that people who were there are going to start asking questions." Olivia pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which she had never done before on a shift. Patsy glanced over from behind the counter, clocked it, and went back to what she was doing. "If she publishes without my name," Olivia said, "who does the story land on?" "Probably the unit command. The people who wrote the official record." He met her eyes. "The people who made sure a combat medic who saved a dog under fire and stayed with a dying soldier didn't appear anywhere in the official documentation of that night." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Because I left the service," she said. "I didn't fight the exit process. I didn't request a review of what happened. I went. I know. So they let me go, and they wrote the record, and nobody was left to contradict it. That's correct?" She looked at the surface of the table. Someone had carved initials into it years ago near the edge, TW, and she had noticed it 1,000 times without ever wondering who TW was. "What's her name?" Olivia asked. "The journalist." "Bren Kowalski. She's been doing military accountability work for 8 years. She's not interested in sensationalizing anything. I looked into her. She does the kind of pieces that are hard to write and harder to ignore." He paused. She asked if I could put her in contact with anyone who had direct knowledge of the operation. Olivia looked up. "She's asking for me. She's asking for whoever was there. She doesn't know it's you." He was careful with his voice, not pushing, just laying out the terrain. "She's going to find out eventually. The question is whether you're part of the story or whether the story happens to you." The diner was filling up around them. The Thursday morning crowd, the regulars, the retirees, the occasional unfamiliar face, the smell of coffee and bacon, and the particular flatness of commercial cleaning products on linoleum. The world Olivia had built inside of, small and specific and hers. "You sat across from me for 3 years," she said. "I did." "You figured it out from a photograph, a grainy overhead shot." She shook her head slightly. "Did you know before Bear reacted to me?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Honest. "I had a feeling," he said. "The way you moved. The way you looked at Bear when you thought nobody was watching. Not like he was a dog you were curious about. Like he was something you'd already taken responsibility for a long time ago." He paused. "I told myself I was wrong, but I kept the photograph on my phone." She absorbed this. Something in it was uncomfortable, the being watched aspect, being read by someone when she thought she was unreadable. And something in it was also, against her own preferences, a relief, that someone had paid enough attention to see it. "I'll talk to her," Olivia said. "The journalist." Marcus kept his expression level. "On my terms," she added. "My timeline. I'm not doing this on a deadline somebody else set because it's convenient for a publishing schedule." "I'll let her know." Olivia stood up, smoothed her apron, picked up a water pitcher from the adjacent table because she needed something in her hands. "You should probably eat your breakfast," she said. "You've been nursing that coffee for 20 minutes. I was waiting to see if you'd sit down. Don't get used to it." She went back to work. Bren Kowalski drove up from Missoula 12 days later and sat in a window booth at Kettle and Creek at 2 in the afternoon, which was the dead hour when Patsy sent the other waitress home, and it was just Olivia finishing the closeout setup. Olivia had arranged it that way deliberately. Patsy had been told there was a woman coming to meet her and had asked no questions, which remained the best thing about Patsy. Bren was younger than Olivia expected, early 40s, with the kind of focused tired that came from years of caring about things that didn't get easier. She had a notepad, a recorder, and a laptop bag she didn't open. She ordered tea and didn't write anything down for the first 15 minutes, which was either a technique or a genuine instinct, but either way, Olivia respected it. They talked around the edges first. How long had Olivia been in Millhaven? What her service record covered, the parts she was willing to confirm. What Bren's piece was actually about, not the mission specifically, but the pattern. The unaccounted personnel, the medics and support staff who appeared in footage and field reports, and then vanished from the official narrative because they'd left voluntarily or been encouraged to leave, and the institutional machinery that allowed records to be written by whoever was left standing. "I'm not trying to litigate the mission," Bren said. "I'm not interested in naming what went wrong tactically. That's not my beat." She turned the tea mug in her hands. "What I'm interested in is the after. What happens to the people who were there but don't show up in the record? What happens to a family when the record is incomplete? And what happens when someone who should have been recognized just disappears?" "People disappear when disappearing is easier than fighting," Olivia said. "Was it easier?" Olivia considered the question honestly. "At the time," she said, "yes. I was 28, I was grieving, I was exhausted, and the people who controlled the process made it very clear that pursuing any kind of formal review of what happened was going to be long and painful and probably unsuccessful." She paused. "I told myself I was making a practical decision." "Do you still think that?" "I think I was 28 and grieving and exhausted." She met Bren's eyes. "I think the people who made it clear that a review would be painful knew that I was 28 and grieving and exhausted." Bren looked at her for a moment. "Can I turn the recorder on?" Olivia looked at the small device on the table between them. The diner was quiet. Outside, the October wind was picking up and the light was going orange and thin the way it did in Montana in the late afternoon, coming through the window at an angle that turned everything it touched briefly gold. She thought about Sandra Dawson saying, "I just had the official letter." She thought about Ray, who had been calm when things were unsurvivable, who had carried a dog through 300 meters of blown terrain because he wasn't the kind of person who left things behind. She thought about 37 months of being invisible, and how that had been a choice she'd made because it seemed like the only one available, and how choices like that had a way of calcifying into facts if you didn't examine them. She pushed the recorder closer to her side of the table. "Yes," she said. And somewhere across Millhaven, in the house on Sycamore that Marcus Hale rented month to month because he also had not fully committed to the idea of being somewhere permanently, Bear was lying in a square of afternoon sunlight on the kitchen floor with his chin on his paws, breathing slow and even, his scar catching the light the same way it had caught Olivia's hand 6 years ago in the dark outside Kandahar, a thing made by damage that had since become simply a part of what he was, unremarkable, healed, marking something that had happened and been survived. Bren Kowalski pressed record. Olivia Mercer began to talk. And 400 miles south, in a military records office in a building whose facade had been renovated twice since 2018, a man named Gerald Pratt, deputy records officer, 3rd tier, with a pension 8 months out and a very specific investment in certain documentation remaining exactly as he had written it, received a routine inquiry email flagged with Bren Kowalski's press credentials. He read it twice. Then he picked up his personal phone, not his office line, and made a call to a number he hadn't dialed in over a year. "We have a problem," he said. The man Gerald Pratt called was named Vincent Aldra. Aldra had retired from the military 3 years ago with the kind of exit that came with a handshake, a commendation letter, and a tacit understanding about what was expected of him afterward. I was 54, lived outside Denver in a house with a good fence and a truck he kept very clean, and he had spent his final 12 years in service as a senior operations documentation officer, which was a title that meant, in practice, that he decided what the official record said and what it didn't say, and he was very good at making those decisions in ways that were technically defensible. He listened to Pratt for 2 minutes without interrupting. "How far along is she?" Aldra asked. The email was specific. She has field kit evidence, footage confirmation, and at least one corroborating source with direct knowledge. Name? She didn't disclose a source name. but she referenced the Dawson family by name and she mentioned Atlas. A pause. Nobody outside the unit knew that dog's name, Vince. That's not public record. Aldra was quiet for a moment. Through his kitchen window, the Denver suburbs did their ordinary Saturday afternoon things. A kid on a bike, someone reversing out of a driveway, the flat normality of a life with no operational exposure. Find out who she's been talking to in Mill Haven, Aldra said. Marcus Hale is stationed there. He had the dog. I know where Hale is. Find out who else. He paused. And pull the original documentation index. I want to know exactly what exists in physical form and what's been digitized. The index hasn't been touched since I filed it. Then touch it now, Aldra said, quietly, and don't use your office computer. He hung up. He stood at his kitchen window for a moment longer. Then he went to the shelf in his home office where he kept a secondary phone. Not a burner, nothing so obvious, just a personal device he'd kept off his primary accounts for years, and began making a different call, one that went further up than Pratt. Olivia didn't know about Aldra. Not yet. What she knew on the Saturday morning after her conversation with Bren Kowalski was that she had talked on record for 2 hours and 17 minutes, and she felt the way she imagined people felt after major surgery, hollowed out, tender in unexpected places, functional, but not yet sure what functional was going to mean going forward. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table in the apartment that still looked like somewhere she was staying temporarily, and she drank it, and she didn't think about what she'd said because she'd said it, and the recorder had it, and there was nothing to unthink. Bren had told her the piece would likely publish in 3 to 4 weeks, pending editorial review and legal. She had been clear about what would be in it: the pattern of erased personnel, the documentation failures, Olivia's specific case as the central narrative thread, and clear about what wouldn't. She wasn't naming the mission by its classified designation. She wasn't publishing tactical details. She was writing about what happened to a medic who did her job and then ceased to exist in the official version of events. Is there anything you want me to make sure I get right? Bren had asked, near the end. Olivia had thought about it. Ray Dawson wasn't abandoned, she said. I need that to be clear. He wasn't left. Everything that could be done was done. I need his family to read that and believe it, not because it makes me look better, but because it's true, and they've been without that piece for 6 years. Bren had looked at her for a moment. I'll make it clear, she said. The problem developed on Wednesday. Marcus called her at 7 in the morning, which was early for him, and when she answered, he skipped hello entirely. Have you looked at your email this morning? No, I don't check email before 8. Check it. She put him on speaker and opened her laptop. There was one new message from an address she didn't recognize, a string of letters and numbers at a generic domain that screamed either spam or deliberate obfuscation. The subject line was blank. The body contained 4 sentences. You spoke to a journalist this week. This is a mistake you can still correct. The documentation from 2018 is complete and legally certified. Any claim to the contrary will be challenged by people with significantly more resources than you have. That was all. I got the same one, Marcus said. Different wording, but same message. Olivia read it again. The specific cold of it, not threatening in any language that could be used against the sender, just a statement of facts arranged to produce maximum unease. Forward it to Bren, Marcus said. Already doing it. And Dora Winslow, she has legal contacts. Olivia was already typing. Who has access to my email address? It's not hard to find if you know to look. You're on the diner's website, staff page. It lists a general contact. That's Patsy's email for the diner. It routes to you for the scheduling inquiries. Patsy mentioned it to Dale Pritchett at the counter about 3 weeks ago when he was trying to confirm his birthday reservation. A pause. Small town. Olivia sent the forward. She closed her laptop. They're trying to find out how much we have before Bren publishes, she said. That's what I think too. Which means they know about Bren. Her press inquiry email would have gone through official channels. It would have been logged. His voice was level, not alarmed, but with an undertone she recognized. The alertness of someone who has dealt with institutional pressure before and knows what the early stages feel like. This isn't illegal what they've done. The email doesn't threaten anything specific. They're just letting you know they're aware. Intimidation without fingerprints. They've had practice. She stood up from the table and moved to the window. The street below was quiet. A truck she didn't recognize was parked across from the hardware store, which was not remarkable except that she noticed it, and she trusted the instinct that said to notice it. "I'm not stopping," she said. "I didn't think you were," Marcus said. "I just wanted to make sure you'd seen it." Bren Kowalski, when Olivia reached her that afternoon, did not seem surprised. She seemed like someone who had been through a version of this before and had made peace with its mechanics. "They'll escalate the pressure before they try anything legal," Bren said. "This is the soft phase. They're trying to find out if you're the kind of person who goes away." "I'm not." "Good. Then we keep moving." A brief pause, and Olivia heard the sound of papers, or maybe a keyboard. "I need to tell you something that I found this morning. My editor flagged it. A formal inquiry to the publication from a legal firm representing an unnamed client asking about any pending pieces touching on classified operations. They didn't specify which operation. They don't have to. The inquiry itself is the message." "How does that affect your timeline?" "It accelerates it," Bren said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite satisfaction, but was its neighbor. "The moment they file a legal inquiry, they create a record of their awareness, which means if they try to suppress publication afterward, there's a paper trail." She paused. "I'm moving the piece to 2 weeks. My editor has already approved." 2 weeks. "There's one more thing I need from you," Bren said, "and I need you to think about whether you can do it." Olivia waited. "Sandra Dawson has agreed to speak on record. She's going to talk about what the family was told versus what actually happened, and what it meant to get the full picture through you." Bren's voice was careful. "The piece is stronger with her, but it means your connection to the Dawson family becomes part of the published record. Your relationship to Ray becomes documented." Olivia sat down on the edge of her bed. "That was always going to happen," she said. "I wanted to make sure you'd thought it through." "I've thought it through." She pressed the heel of her hand against her knee. "Use whatever Sandra gave you. She's the one who's been living with the incomplete version. If her voice helps close that gap, then that's what matters." After she hung up, she looked around the apartment. The single chair. The door that never hung right. 37 months. She pulled out her phone and called Dora Winslow. "They sent an email," she said when Dora answered. "I need to know what my legal exposure is if they decide to challenge my account of the mission." "I'm already on it," Dora said. "I have a veteran legal advocate in Billings who has handled documentation disputes before. Can you come in Thursday?" "Yes." "Bring everything. Any records you kept, any personal documentation, anything you wrote down at the time." A pause. "You did write things down, didn't you?" "Yes," Olivia said. "Good girl." "Well, she had a notebook, one composition notebook, the black and white kind, bought at a PX in 2016 and carried through 2 deployments and the entirety of the 2018 mission and everything after. She kept it in a fireproof lockbox under the bed, which had been the first thing she bought when she moved into the Millhaven apartment, before she bought a second set of towels or a second plate. The notebook was more important than those things. She hadn't opened it in over a year. She opened it Thursday morning before she drove to Billings, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, and read the entries from September 2018 with the particular detachment of someone reading their own past handwriting, familiar and foreign at once. Her notes were clinical. That was the training. Document everything, date everything, dosages and timings and assessment findings. The entries from the mission read like a field log because they were a field log, written in the hours after she'd been extracted, before she fully understood what the official record was going to say and not say. 340, canine patient, BM, male, approx. GSW, graze right shoulder, secondary laceration, jaw-neck junction, approx 5 centimeters, hemorrhage controlled, sutured under low-light conditions, patient stable at handoff. She had noted Ray's name below that entry, not as a medical record, but as a fact she was recording because she needed to write it somewhere. Sergeant Raymond Dawson, KIA. 0412, I was present. I want that in writing somewhere, even if it's only here. The advocate's name was Peter Holloway, and he met them at Dora's office and spent 2 hours with the notebook, with gloves on, going through it page by page with the focus of someone who knew exactly what to look for. "This is contemporaneous documentation," he said, which Olivia knew, but the way he said it was not for her benefit. It was him confirming something to himself. Dates, times, specific medical notation. This is the kind of record that is very difficult to argue wasn't written at the time it claims to have been written. He looked up. Do you have anything else? Personal photographs from the deployment, pre-mission, not from the night itself, and a copy of my original service separation documents. Any communications? Texts? Emails? From the time? She thought about it. Nothing that referenced the mission specifically. There were things I wrote that I deleted because I didn't know who might see them. I was 28, and I wasn't thinking clearly about what I should be protecting. Holloway nodded, without judgment. That's common. What you have is more than most people have. He set the notebook down carefully. Here's where things stand legally. The original documentation was filed by a records officer. If that documentation is shown to contradict a contemporaneous field record like this one, the discrepancy becomes a formal legal question, not just a he said, she said. The burden shifts. He paused. They know that. That's why the email came. What do they do next? Marcus asked. He'd driven down with her, sat in the corner through most of the meeting, and had not said much except when he had something specific to add. They have a few options. They can try to discredit the notebook, claim it was created after the fact, though the ink oxidation and paper aging will work against them. They can try to obtain a legal injunction against the article, which will fail, but will cost time. Or they can try to address the discrepancy before publication by issuing a supplemental record, which would mean admitting there was an error, Dora said. Or claiming there was, Holloway said. There's a difference. One is accountability, the other is damage control. Don't assume you can tell them apart from the outside. Olivia looked at the notebook on the table. The publication is in 2 weeks, she said. Holloway looked at her steadily. Then we have 2 weeks to make sure everything you have is documented, copied, and held in multiple secure locations. Whatever they do, they can't do it if the information is already out of their reach. The next escalation came 6 days before publication. It didn't come as an email. It came as a visit. She was at work. A Tuesday morning, full breakfast crowd. When a man she didn't recognize came in and sat at the counter. Mid-50s, neat clothes, the kind of unremarkable appearance that took effort. He ordered coffee and eggs and ate them unhurriedly and tipped 20% exactly, and when Olivia came to clear his plate, he said quietly and without looking up, Miss Mercer, my name isn't important. I represent people who would like to resolve this situation before it becomes public. Olivia picked up his plate. Your eggs okay? She said. He looked up at her. Something moved through his expression, slight recalibration. There are ways to handle this that don't require your personal exposure, he said. A private acknowledgement, some adjustment to the record, handled internally, without a news story. That sounds like what they should have done 6 years ago, Olivia said. I understand your frustration. I'm not frustrated, she said. I'm working. You're in my section. Are you getting anything else? He was quiet for a moment. The people I represent are not interested in making your life difficult, he said. They're interested in a controlled resolution, controlled by them, managed professionally. She set the plate down on the busing tray. She looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. The people you represent had 6 years to manage this professionally, she said. They chose a different approach. I'm not interested in helping them manage the consequence of that choice. She picked up the tray. Have a good morning. She walked back to the kitchen. Her hands were completely steady. She registered this with something that wasn't quite pride, more like recognition. There it was. The thing that had been there the whole time, under 3 years of aprons and refilled coffee mugs and performed invisibility. She set the tray down on the pass-through and pulled out her phone and texted Marcus one word. Here. Marcus was in the diner 4 minutes later. She didn't know if he'd been waiting or if he'd been close, and it didn't matter. He walked in, saw the man at the counter who was finishing his coffee with the patience of someone who had not yet received the answer he needed, and sat 2 stools away and ordered coffee from Patsy. The man from the counter left 8 minutes after Marcus arrived. He didn't look at either of them on his way out. Patsy waited until the door closed. Friend of yours? She asked, refilling Marcus's mug. No, Olivia said. Patsy made the sound she made when something was obvious and she was choosing not to say so, and went back to the register. Bren published on a Thursday. The piece went up at 6 in the morning Eastern Time, which was 4 in the morning in Montana, and Olivia found out about it when her phone buzzed with a text from Bren. It's live. I'm sorry for the hour. Brace yourself. She sat up in bed and read it on her phone in the dark. It was 5,000 words, and it was the most careful piece of writing she'd read in years. Bren had done something difficult. She had made the story about the pattern without losing the specific human weight of the individual cases, and she'd threaded Olivia's account through it with a precision that felt like something achieved rather than executed. Ray was in it, who he was, not just what happened to him. Sandra's words were in it. Atlas was in it, and the scar, and the field kit, and the name written in permanent marker on the inside cover. The final paragraph was about what got lost when institutions decided which parts of a story were worth keeping. It named no names in that paragraph. It didn't need to. By 7 that morning, Olivia's name had been picked up by 3 other outlets. By 9, Dora Winslow had called to tell her that the Veteran Wellness Network had received 62 messages about the piece in 3 hours, and the number was climbing. By noon, Marcus was sitting in his corner booth reading his phone with an expression she couldn't fully interpret, something between relief and the careful grief of a man confirming something he'd known for a long time but hadn't been able to prove. Bear lay under the table and breathed. Olivia worked her shift. She worked it because it was her shift, and because standing still had always been harder than moving, and because the world did not pause for revelations. Tables still needed clearing, coffee still went cold, the lunch crowd came in the same as any Thursday. But she was aware, in a way she hadn't been the day before, that the sealed compartment was fully open now and there was no putting it back. The story existed in the world outside her apartment, outside Millhaven, outside her own careful management of what she allowed people to know. It was out there being read by people she would never meet, who had known Ray, or known people like Ray, who had been in rooms like the one she'd been in, or had loved people who had, and some of them were going to feel things about it. She couldn't predict and couldn't control. That was terrifying. She held it while she refilled coffee and punched in orders and said, "You're welcome to people who weren't thinking about any of it." At 2 in the afternoon, when the lunch crowd thinned and Olivia was resetting tables near the window, she saw a black SUV parked across the street. Not the truck from before. Different vehicle, darker, with government plates. She set down the salt shaker she was holding. Marcus appeared beside her without being called. He had seen it too. "That's not local," he said. "No. DOD plates." He kept his voice even. "They move faster than I thought." "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the vehicle. It hadn't moved. No one had gotten out. "It means Bren's piece hit something harder than they expected," he said. "When they send someone to watch and not engage, they're still deciding what to do." He paused. "Which means they don't have a clean play yet. Or they're waiting for something," Olivia said. "Yeah," Marcus said, "or that." The SUV sat there through the rest of her shift. When she walked out at 3:15, it was still there. She didn't look at it directly. She got in her car and drove home and went upstairs and stood in her apartment and called Dora Winslow's number and got voicemail. She called Holloway next. He answered. "The piece is out," she said, "and there's a government vehicle sitting outside my workplace." A pause. She heard him moving, a door closing. "Is it still there?" "I'm not at work anymore. I don't know." "All right, listen to me. Do you have somewhere you can stay tonight that isn't your apartment? Not a hotel, somewhere personal." The question landed strangely. She hadn't thought about this as something that might require physical repositioning. "Marcus Hale," she said. "He has a house. Call him. Don't go back to your apartment tonight if you can avoid it. Not because you're in danger. I don't think you're in danger. But because if they're surveilling, I don't want them to know your patterns before we've had time to respond formally." "Formally how?" "I'm filing a complaint with the DOD Inspector General's office in the morning. The email, the counter visit, the surveillance, taken together, they constitute an improper pressure campaign against a civilian who provided information to the press. Filing this creates a record that makes escalating against you much more legally costly for them." He paused. "This is the part where the scales start to shift. They've been operating in the space where they're bigger than you. We're going to change the geometry." Olivia sat down on her bed. "How long does this take?" she said. "A complaint of this type triggers a mandatory review period of 45 days. 45 days. But it also triggers mandatory protective protocols for the complainant. Once it's filed, any action taken against you is subject to review as potential retaliation." He paused. "They know this. The moment I file, their options narrow significantly. She pressed her free hand flat on the mattress. "File it," she said. "I'll have it ready by 8 tomorrow morning." He paused again, and the pause had a different quality, something that was not legal information. "Ms. Mercer, for what it's worth. What I read in that piece this morning, what you did, and what was done to the record afterward. I've been in this work for 18 years, and I've seen a lot of cases. This one is cleaner than most. You have the contemporaneous documentation, you have a corroborating source in the Dawson family, you have evidence of a pressure campaign that they initiated, and you have a published piece of journalism that is already being cited by 3 major veteran advocacy organizations as of this afternoon." He let that land. "They don't have a clean play. That's not an accident. That's because you did this right." Olivia said nothing for a moment. "I did it scared," she said. "That's what right looks like most of the time," Holloway said, and hung up. She sat in her apartment for a while. Then she called Marcus. "I need to ask if I can stay tonight," she said. "My lawyer thinks it's a good idea." "Already made up the couch," Marcus said. "I figured." She almost laughed. It came out slightly wrong, like something that had been stored in a sealed compartment for 6 years and had forgotten the exact shape of itself. "I'll be there in an hour," she said. She was packing a bag, one change of clothes, her laptop, the fireproof lockbox, when her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Montana area code. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Is this Olivia Mercer?" A woman's voice. Careful, like someone who had rehearsed the first sentence. "Yes." "My name is Sheila Dawson, Ray's mother." A pause. "I've been trying to find a number for you since this morning. I read the article. Her voice broke slightly and came back. "I've been trying to understand why nobody told me this for 6 years, and I can't understand it. I'm not going to be able to understand it tonight." Another pause. "But I needed to call and say thank you for staying with him, for writing his name down." Her voice went quieter. "He didn't know who you were when he was with you, I imagine, but I'm glad you knew who he was." Olivia sat on the floor of her apartment with her back against the bed, the same position she'd been in when she opened the notebook. "He talked about Macy," she said, "and he talked about you. Not in detail, just, he said his mom would understand why he didn't call enough, that she'd know he was thinking about her." Sheila Dawson made a sound on the other end of the line that Olivia would not describe later, because it was private, and it was the sound of 6 years of not knowing, finally landing somewhere it could rest. They talked for 20 minutes. After Olivia hung up, she finished packing her bag and locked the apartment and went downstairs and got in her car. She was 3 blocks from Marcus's house when her phone lit up again. This time, it was Bren Kowalski. "I need you to know something," Bren said without preamble. "The piece has been picked up by the AP Wire as of 40 minutes ago." Olivia kept driving. "Okay," she said, "which means it's national, which means every major veteran organization in the country is going to have it by morning, which means the people who sent that email and put that man in your diner are about to have a very bad week." She paused. "And it means that a congressman on the Armed Services Committee, whose office called my editor 2 hours ago, would like to know if you'd be willing to speak to his staff." Olivia pulled up in front of Marcus's house and sat in the dark car for a moment. "Tell them I need a few days," she said. "That's a yes?" "That's a not yet," she said. "Tell them not yet." She hung up. She sat in the car. Through Marcus's front window, she could see the light was on, and the faint outline of Bear's silhouette near the window. The dog who had crossed a diner to find her, whose scar she had made in the dark, who had survived the thing that Ray hadn't, and who had been living quietly in this town, waiting without knowing he was waiting. Until the morning, everything started to come undone. She got out of the car. She was almost to the front door when her phone lit up one more time. The number was a Washington, D.C. area code. She stared at it for 3 full seconds. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket and knocked on the door. And when Marcus opened it and Bear pressed immediately against her leg, she stood there for a moment with her hand on the dog's head and the DC number still unanswered and glowing in her pocket. And she understood, with the kind of clarity that came not from readiness but from having no remaining choice, that the next thing that happened was going to be something she couldn't manage quietly. The door was already open. She answered it on the 4th ring, standing on Marcus's front porch, with Bear pressed against her leg, and the cold coming down off the mountains in the way it did in Montana in October, like it had somewhere else to be and was just passing through. "Ms. Mercer," a man's voice. Measured, the kind of measured that was professional rather than natural. My name is Congressman Dale Ferris. I apologize for the hour. I'm calling personally because I didn't want this to come through staff, and I wanted you to hear it directly. Olivia stood very still. Okay. I read Bren Kowalski's piece this afternoon. I've also spoken with my office's contact at the DoD IG, who tells me a complaint was filed on your behalf this morning. A brief pause. I want you to know that my office is going to request a full formal inquiry into the documentation practices surrounding your service record and the mission in question. That request goes in tomorrow. I appreciate that, Olivia said carefully. I also want to be honest with you about what that means in practical terms. It means a process. It means time. It means the people who manage this are going to have lawyers, and they're going to use every procedural tool available to slow things down. His voice was direct but not unkind, the voice of someone who had been doing this long enough to stop dressing things up. I'm not going to promise you a fast resolution. I'm going to promise you that my office is going to stay on it and that you'll have a direct contact on my staff who will keep you informed at every stage. What do you need from me? Right now, nothing. Keep working with your legal advocate. Don't speak to any government representative who contacts you outside of Peter Holloway being present. He paused again. And Ms. Mercer, I read what you wrote in that notebook. I read what Sandra Dawson said about what it meant to her family. I want you to know that whatever the process looks like from the outside, the substance of what you did is not in question, not in my office. Olivia looked out at the dark street. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. The specific weight of them, the way they changed the quality of silence in this valley. Thank you, Congressman, she said. She hung up and went inside. Marcus was in the kitchen making something that smelled like soup. He didn't ask about the call. She sat at his kitchen table and Bear lay down on her feet, all 72 pounds of him, which was uncomfortable and which she didn't move to stop. Congressman Ferris, she said. Marcus turned from the stove. He called you directly? Personal cell, not staff. Marcus turned back to the stove and stirred something. He's on the Armed Services Committee. He's been pushing the documentation accountability issue for 2 sessions. He paused. He's also up for re-election in 14 months, which doesn't make his interest wrong, but it's worth knowing it's there. I know, Olivia said. I'm not naive about why people pick up causes. I know you're not. He ladled soup into 2 bowls without asking if she wanted any. She did want some. What did he say? She told him. He listened while he set the bowls on the table and sat down, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, the same way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than preparing to talk. 45-day review on the IG complaint, he said. Formal congressional inquiry on top of that. Those run on parallel tracks. They don't accelerate each other, but they also create 2 separate institutional pressures. He picked up his spoon. Aldra and Pratt are going to be sitting in rooms with lawyers by end of week. Do you know Aldra? I know of him. He was documentation command, not field. The kind of officer who existed in a layer between what happened and what got written down. His jaw moved. We had one of those in my unit too. Different situation, but the same type. Olivia ate some soup. It was good. Not restaurant good, but real. The kind of thing someone made because they'd been making it long enough to know what worked. She was hungry in a way she hadn't fully noticed until she was eating. I'm going to have to go to Washington, she said. At some point. Probably. I've never testified before anything official. Holloway will prep you. He looked at her. You've done harder things with less preparation. That was different. I wasn't the one talking. I was the one doing something with my hands. He nodded slowly. Yeah. This is going to feel different. She ate the rest of the soup. Bear had moved off her feet and was lying near the back door, watching them both with the calm attention of an animal that tracked patterns. I'm going to call Sandra tomorrow, Olivia said. I want to hear from her directly how the piece landed before I read the comments on it. Smart. And I want to talk to Matey at some point, when it's appropriate. Not now, but eventually. She paused. Ray showed me a picture of her. I've been carrying that for 6 years, and she should probably know it. Marcus didn't say anything to that. Some things didn't need a response. The morning brought 4 things in rough sequence. First, Peter Holloway called at 7:40 to confirm the IG complaint had been formally received and docketed. Second, Bren Kowalski texted a link to a Veteran Advocacy Coalition's public statement in support of Olivia's account, signed by 11 organizations. Third, Patsy called to ask, in Patsy's particular idiom, which involved very few words, whether Olivia was coming in for her Thursday shift, to which Olivia said yes, and Patsy said good, and hung up. Fourth, at 8:15, a certified letter arrived at Olivia's apartment building. She wasn't there to receive it, but Gus, who had a key and who accepted packages, signed for it and left it outside her door. She found it when she went back to change before her shift. The return address was a law firm in Arlington, Virginia. She photographed it without opening it and sent the photograph to Holloway. His response came back in 4 minutes. "Don't open it. I'll be there by this afternoon." This is what I expected. They're trying to establish a legal engagement before the IG review begins. She put the envelope on her kitchen table and drove to work. The diner was different that morning. Not loudly different. Nothing in Millhaven went loudly, but different in the specific way of a small town that had processed overnight the fact that something significant had happened to one of its own. People she'd served for 3 years looked at her with a slightly altered quality of attention. Not intrusive, just aware. Dale Pritchett, who talked to everyone, was quiet at the counter. 2 women at table 4 that she knew by face but not name left a tip that was larger than usual, which was its own kind of statement. Patsy, for her part, behaved with the exact same matter-of-fact efficiency as always, which was the most meaningful response Olivia could have received. Marcus came in at his usual time. Bear settled under the table. Olivia brought the coffee. "The certified letter," she said. "I heard. Holloway texted me too. It's a legal play to slow the process." "I know." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "There's something else. Bren called me this morning. The AP pickup moved some things faster than we expected. There's a senator now, Doris Nakamura. She sits on the Veterans Affairs Committee, who put out a statement this morning calling for an immediate review of documentation practices for personnel separating under ambiguous circumstances." He paused. "She named your case by description, not by name. But there's only one case matching that description in the news cycle right now." Olivia absorbed this. How does Aldra respond to a Senate statement? "That's what I've been thinking about." Marcus turned the mug in his hands. "Aldra is a retired officer. He has no current institutional protection. Whatever cover he had while he was inside the system, he's been outside it for 3 years. That changes his position significantly when 2 separate federal oversight bodies are looking at work he did while in service. Pratt is still inside. Pratt is a 3rd-tier records officer, 8 months from pension." Marcus's voice was flat and precise. He made a phone call on a personal device to a retired officer 6 days after a press inquiry came through official channels. If the IG pulls phone records, which they will, it's standard in a documentation fraud review. That call is going to require explanation. Olivia looked at her notepad. Table 4 needed a refill. "It's still going to take time," she said. "Yes. And while it takes time, I'm living in Millhaven and working here, and my name is in the AP wire, and the people who sent that letter know where I live." "Also, yes." He met her eyes. "None of that changes what's already in motion. It just means the next few weeks are going to be uncomfortable." "The last 6 years were uncomfortable." "Different kind," he said. "This one ends." She went to refill table 4 and man. Holloway arrived at 2 in the afternoon, drove straight to the diner, and sat in the booth Marcus had vacated. He was carrying a leather bag that looked like it had been through a lot, and he ordered coffee black and got straight to it. The certified letter, he explained, was a cease and desist from a firm representing Vincent Aldra personally. It claimed that Olivia's statements to Bren Kowalski constituted defamation, and that the publication of those statements had caused material harm to Aldra's professional reputation. "This is not a strong filing," Holloway said, turning his mug. "Defamation requires demonstrable falsehood. Your statements are documented, corroborated, and contemporaneous. The existence of a notebook written in 2018 alone is going to make their case very difficult." He paused. "But that's not really the point of the letter." "The point is to make me spend money I don't have defending against it," Olivia said. "The point is to make you spend money and time and psychological energy that could otherwise go toward the IG process, and to signal that coming after you is cheap for them and expensive for you." He folded his hands on the table. "Except that it's not. Because my representation of you in this matter is being underwritten by the Veterans Legal Defense Consortium, who contacted me this morning and offered to cover costs for exactly this type of retaliatory legal action. Olivia looked at him. Since when? Since about 8 this morning, when the consortium's executive director read Bren's piece over her coffee. He allowed himself a small, dry expression. You have more institutional support than you did 48 hours ago. That changes the math considerably. She sat back. The lunch crowd was thinning. Patsy was doing the closeout setup at the far end of the counter, within earshot but not listening, which was a distinction Patsy maintained with remarkable consistency. I want to respond to the letter, Olivia said. We will. Formally, through me. You don't engage directly. I know, but I want the response to be specific. I want it to reference the IG complaint by docket number and the congressional inquiry by date. I want whoever reads it on Aldra's side to understand exactly what he's standing in front of. Holloway looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. I'll draft it tonight, he said. Gerald Pratt, it turned out, was the first one to break. Olivia found out through Holloway, who found out through his IG contact, which was how most things moved. Not directly, but through a chain of people paying attention and passing information in the careful way of people who understood what each piece was worth. Pratt had retained personal counsel, separate from Aldra's firm, which was the significant detail, and had requested a meeting with the IG investigator assigned to the complaint. He had not yet said what he intended to offer. But retaining separate counsel and requesting a voluntary meeting was, Holloway explained, the behavior of someone who had decided that the person he'd been aligned with was no longer a safe bet. He's going to cooperate, Holloway said on the phone 11 days after the article published. He may not give them everything, and he may try to minimize his own role, but he's positioning to provide information in exchange for some protection on the pension question. The pension question, Olivia said. If the IG finds that he participated in fraudulent documentation, his federal pension is at risk. He's 8 months from full vesting. Holloway's voice was matter-of-fact. He is choosing his retirement over his loyalty to Vincent Aldra, which is, honestly, a predictable choice for a man in his position. What does Aldra do when he finds out Pratt flipped? He either provides his own version first, or he lawyers up harder and prepares to contest everything. A pause. I'm told, through a contact I won't name, that Aldra has already been contacted by the Congressional Inquiry staff for a formal interview. He'll refuse. He'll try, but congressional inquiries have subpoena power if the committee chair authorizes it, and Senator Nakamura has already indicated she's prepared to authorize. Holloway paused again. Here's the thing about the position Aldra is in. He wrote a record. That record is now being compared item by item against a contemporaneous notebook, a published piece of journalism, corroborating testimony from a soldier's widow, and the physical evidence of a living dog with a specific surgical scar. He can contest each piece individually, and his lawyers will try to, but the cumulative picture does not have an innocent explanation. Olivia was in her apartment. She'd gone back after the first 2 nights at Marcus's. The SUV hadn't returned, and she wasn't going to let the possibility of surveillance reorganize her life permanently. She was standing at her kitchen counter, which was her thinking position, the place she stood when she needed to process something. He knows that, she said. Aldra knows the cumulative picture is indefensible. Yes. So what does a man do when he knows he's indefensible and he still has to do something? He tries to control the narrative of his own culpability, Holloway said. He tries to be the person who admits a limited version of what happened before someone else defines the full version for him. He gives up the minimum necessary to avoid the maximum consequence. Which means we need to make sure the IG has the full picture before Aldra tries to submit the minimum version. Which is exactly why I need everything you have, organized by date, with the medical documentation indexed separately from the personal entries, and copies held by my office, the consortium's office, and in a secure digital location that isn't accessible from your home network. I can do that this weekend. Do it Friday, Holloway said. Don't wait. She did it Friday. She sat at Marcus's kitchen table. He'd offered the space as neutral ground, and she'd accepted. And Bear lay under the table as though this were the most natural domestic arrangement in the world, and she went through the notebook page by page for the second time in 2 weeks, this time with Holloway's paralegal on video call walking her through the indexing process. The paralegal's name was Tamara, and she was efficient without being impersonal, which Olivia appreciated. They worked for 3 hours. The medical entries were separated and flagged. The personal entries were marked as contextual but not probative. The specific entry about Ray, the one she'd written in the hours after extraction, the one that placed her at the location at the specific time, was copied 4 times and stored in 4 separate places. When they were done, Tamara said, "Can I ask you something that's not about the indexing?" "Okay." "The entry you wrote about Ray Dawson, the last few lines," she paused. "Did you know when you wrote them that they might matter later?" Olivia looked at the notebook, closed now, on Marcus's kitchen table. "No," she said. "I wrote them because I needed them to exist somewhere, that's all." Tamara nodded slowly. "I thought so. It reads that way. It's going to read better to an investigator that way than if it seemed calculated. Things written for no audience are different from things written to protect yourself." After the call ended, Olivia sat with the notebook for a moment. Then she put it back in the lockbox and pushed the lockbox across the table to Marcus, who put it in his gun safe without being asked. The public collapse of Vincent Aldra's position happened faster than anyone predicted, and it happened in the way that these things often happened. Not from the biggest blow, but from an accumulation of smaller ones that reached a threshold all at once. Pratt's cooperation produced 2 things. First, confirmation that the original documentation index had been accessed and modified after Olivia's separation from service. Specifically, 3 entries that referenced unaccounted medical personnel had been redacted and replaced with a notation that the field roster was incomplete due to communication failure. Second, a copy of an email chain from 2018 between Pratt and an address linked to Aldra's then official account, in which the language was indirect but the intent was not. The personnel gap needs to be addressed before the summary is finalized, and make sure the kit inventory closes cleanly. And the one that landed hardest, the medic's separation is processing through normal channels, so there's no need to flag anything to review. The medic. Her. She had been a loose end to be managed and she hadn't even known it. Holloway called her on a Tuesday morning while she was driving to work. "The IG investigator received Pratt's documentation yesterday," he said. "The email chain is now part of the formal record. Aldra's attorneys received notification that his voluntary interview request was being converted to a compelled interview under the committee's authority." He paused. "He has 48 hours to respond." "What happens if he doesn't?" "The subpoena is issued, which is a public document." Another pause. "It's going to be news." It was news. The subpoena issued on a Thursday and was reported on Friday morning by 2 military journalism outlets and picked up by the AP by noon. Aldra's name was in print for the first time. The framing was careful: compelled interview, ongoing IG investigation, connection to a published journalism piece. But the structure of what had happened was legible to anyone paying attention. Bren Kowalski published a follow-up piece the same afternoon. It was shorter than the first, 800 words, almost surgical. And it did one thing the original hadn't. It named the modification dates on the documentation index and noted that the modifications had occurred 11 days after Olivia's service separation was finalized. 11 days. Long enough for the separation to close. Precisely timed. The Veteran Coalition's response this time was louder. Senator Nakamura issued a second statement calling for an expedited timeline on the IG review. The Veterans Legal Defense Consortium issued a press release about Olivia's case specifically, identifying it as an example of a pattern they had documented across 14 similar cases over the past decade. 14 cases. Olivia read that number and sat with it for a long time, because it meant that what had happened to her was not a mistake or an anomaly, but something that had been done multiple times and had only now encountered the specific combination of factors that made it visible. She was at Marcus's house when the Coalition press release came out. Bear was lying in the kitchen doorway in the afternoon light, in his favorite spot, and she read the release on her laptop and then closed the laptop and looked at the dog. 14, she said out loud. Not to Marcus, who was in the other room. Just out loud because it needed to be said in the open air and not just in her head. Marcus appeared in the doorway, heard the number, understood it, and said nothing. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment. "You want coffee?" he asked. "No," she said. "I want this to end." "It's ending," he said, "just slower than you want it to." Everything is slower than I want it to. He almost smiled, not quite. Yeah, that's been my experience with most things that matter. Aldra's compelled interview took place in Washington on a Wednesday. Olivia was not there. She was in Mill Haven, working her morning shift, because Holloway had been explicit. She did not need to be present. Her documentation was already in the record, and being absent kept her out of the spectacle of it while remaining fully part of the substance. She found out what happened through Holloway, who called at 4 in the afternoon. He tried to submit the minimum version, Holloway said. He acknowledged that the documentation index contained errors. He characterized them as administrative oversights during a high-volume period. He claimed no knowledge of intentional modification. And the committee staff had Pratt's email chain. They read the relevant passages directly to him in the room. A pause. Specifically the line about the medic's separation processing through normal channels, so there's no need to flag anything to review. Another pause. He had no credible response. He asked to consult with his attorney. The interview was paused and then reconvened, and he spent the next 4 hours giving a much more detailed account than he had intended to give. Olivia was in her car in the parking lot outside the diner. The afternoon was going gray. What does that mean practically, she said. It means the IG investigation is now categorized as substantiated with credible evidence of intentional documentation fraud. That triggers an automatic escalation to the DoD General Counsel's office. It also triggers an administrative review of every personnel record Aldra and Pratt were responsible for during the relevant period. Holloway's voice had the particular texture of a man who had been doing this long enough to understand that what he was about to say was significant without performing significance around it. It means they can no longer claim this was an error, officially, in the record. She pressed her head back against the headrest. And Aldra? He's looking at potential criminal referral for falsification of federal records. His attorneys are going to fight that designation, and they may succeed in reducing it, but the referral is going in. A final pause. Gerald Pratt's pension review has been suspended pending the outcome of the broader investigation, which is not good for him, but that's the cost of only cooperating halfway. Olivia stared at the steering wheel. What about my record? She said. My actual service record. That's the next stage, Holloway said. The documentation correction process. Once the substantiated finding is official, which will be within 30 days, your record can be formally amended to reflect your actual presence and role during the mission. That amendment becomes the official record. He paused. Which also means the commendation question gets reopened. I don't need a commendation. You may not need it, but the process will offer it, and what you do with the offer is your choice. His voice was careful. I just want you to have the full picture. She sat in the parking lot until the gray afternoon started to go dark. Then she drove to Marcus's house because she didn't want to be in her apartment alone. And because she was starting to understand that not wanting to be alone was not weakness, it was just a fact about people. And she had spent 6 years treating it like a problem to be solved. Marcus opened the door before she knocked. Bear pressed against her leg. Holloway called me too, Marcus said. I figured. She went inside. The kitchen light was on. It smelled like coffee and the particular domestic ordinary of a house that was actually being lived in, and Olivia stood in the hallway for a moment and let herself feel the weight of the afternoon, not heavily, but honestly. It's not over, she said. The correction process, the commendation question, the congressional piece? No, Marcus agreed, not over. But the thing that needed to be true is true now, in the official record. She paused. It's documented that I was there. Yes, he said. It's documented. She nodded once, moved into the kitchen, sat at the table where she'd indexed the notebook. Bear lay down under her chair. I need to call Sandra tomorrow, she said. And Sheila. Before this escalates further publicly and they find out through the news instead of through me. Okay. And I need to tell Patsy something, because she's been running interference at the diner for 2 weeks without knowing what she's been interfering with, and she deserves at least a minimal explanation. That conversation is going to be short, Marcus said. Very short, Olivia agreed. That's actually the part I'm least worried about. Marcus set a coffee mug on the table in front of her. She hadn't asked for coffee, but she wrapped both hands around it anyway. Her phone lit up on the table between them. Holloway's number. She answered. One more thing, Holloway said. The consortium's communications director got a call this afternoon from a producer at a National Veteran Affairs news program. They want to do a segment, sit-down interview, taped, focused on the documentation accountability issue broadly and your case specifically. He paused. They want to do it in Millhaven. They want to film at the diner. Olivia looked at the table, the coffee mug, the ordinary surface of Marcus Hale's kitchen on a Wednesday evening. Why the diner? She said. Because the story starts there, with the dog and the scar and a waitress that nobody looked at twice. She was quiet for a moment. How long do I have to decide? They'd like an answer by Friday, Holloway said. But there's no pressure. You've already done the thing that matters. This is just the shape of the aftermath. She thanked him and hung up. Marcus was watching her with the same patient attention he'd been watching her with since the beginning of this. Since the morning he'd looked across a diner and seen someone he'd been trying to find for 5 years. What do you want to do? He said. Olivia looked at the dog under her chair. She thought about a notebook written in the dark for no audience. She thought about Ray Dawson, who had carried an injured dog through 300 meters because he wasn't the kind of person who left things behind. She thought about Macy Dawson, who was 8 years old and had her father's laugh, and had grown up with the official version of a story that was missing its most important parts. She thought about 14 cases, not just hers. I think, she said slowly, that I'm done being the person nobody looks at twice. She picked up the coffee mug. Tell them yes, she said. Tell them to come to the diner. Marcus nodded. He looked like he'd expected that answer. Maybe he had. Outside, the Montana dark had come down fully, and the mountains were invisible but present the way they always were. The specific gravity of things that remained regardless of whether you could see them. And in the morning, Olivia Mercer would go back to work at Kettle and Creek and serve coffee to the people she'd been serving for 3 years. Except that the story that had lived in the sealed compartment was fully out now, officially documented, legally entered into the record, and the woman carrying the tray was not the same woman who had been carrying it when the dog walked across the room and found her. She was the same person. That was different from the same woman. And somewhere in Arlington, Virginia, Vincent Aldra was sitting in a room with his attorneys, working through the implications of an afternoon that had not gone the way he'd managed every previous afternoon for the last 6 years. And the version of events he had written was being taken apart, line by line, by people with the specific patience of institutions that had finally decided to pay attention. And he was beginning to understand, in the concrete and irreversible way of a man reading the actual document, that the record he'd written had not, in the end, stayed written. Olivia Mercer had a notebook. She had a scar on a dog. She had 2 hours and 17 minutes of audio on Bren Kowalski's recorder. She had Sandra Dawson's voice and Sheila Dawson's gratitude, and a congressman's personal cell number and a senator's public statement, and the Veterans Legal Defense Consortium's letterhead and the IG's docket number. She had, it turned out, quite a lot. What she didn't have yet, what was still 48 hours away, in a document that Holloway hadn't told her about yet because it had only been drafted that evening by a DoD staff attorney who was working late and had just finished reading the substantiated finding and understood what it required, was the formal request for her testimony before the Armed Services Subcommittee. Subpoena power went both directions, and the committee, having compelled one man to speak the truth, had decided they wanted to hear from the woman he'd erased. The formal request arrived Thursday morning, delivered by a courier to Peter Holloway's office in Billings, who called Olivia before 9. It's not a subpoena, he said, and she heard the distinction he was making. They could have issued one. They chose not to. It's a formal invitation to provide voluntary testimony before the Armed Services Subcommittee on Personnel Accountability. The language is respectful. They're asking, not compelling. What's the difference practically? The difference is that you walk in as someone who chose to speak rather than someone who was forced to. That matters. For how the testimony is received, for how it's reported, and for how you feel when you're sitting in that room. A pause. It also means you can set conditions. Timeline, format, the scope of questions. We can negotiate those. Olivia was standing in her kitchen. The certified letter from Aldra's attorneys was still on her counter. She hadn't thrown it away, had been keeping it as a reminder of what the pressure had looked like when it was still trying to work. She looked at it now. Tell them yes, she said. Same conditions as before. Holloway present, No classified operational details, scope limited to documentation practices, and the impact on my record. She paused. And I want Sandra Dawson informed before any public announcement of my testimony. She finds out from me, not from a press release. I'll handle it, Holloway said. She called Sandra that evening. Sandra already knew something was coming. She'd been following the news cycle with the particular intensity of someone for whom this was not a news cycle, but a life. And when Olivia told her about the subcommittee invitation, there was a long quiet on the phone. Are you scared? Sandra asked. Olivia thought about lying, then didn't. Yes, she said. I'm better at doing things under fire than talking about them in a room where everyone is watching. Ray was the same way, Sandra said. He used to say the hardest part of coming home wasn't the transition. It was having to explain himself to people who'd never been there. She paused. But he always said it anyway, because he thought it mattered. Olivia held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. I'll tell them what happened, she said finally. The whole thing, not just my part. I know you will, Sandra said. That's why I'm not worried. Washington in November was gray and cold with a particular institutional quality to the cold, the kind that came off marble and concrete rather than mountains, functional rather than beautiful. Olivia flew in the evening before and stayed in a hotel that Holloway's consortium contact had arranged, a quiet place 8 blocks from the Capitol that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. And she sat on the edge of the bed and went over her prepared remarks for the 4th time and then put them away because she knew them and reading them again wasn't going to help. She called Marcus. Bear okay? She said. He's fine, currently destroying a chew toy. A pause. How are you? I'm sitting on a hotel bed in Washington going over remarks I already know. Stop doing that. I know. Get some sleep. I know that too. She looked at the ceiling. I keep thinking about what I'm going to say when I'm actually in the room, not the prepared remarks. Those are fine. I keep thinking about the moment when they ask me to describe what I did and why I stayed. What are you going to say? I'm going to say I stayed because leaving wasn't something I was capable of doing, she said. Not because I was heroic, because I was trained and he was there and the dog was there, and those were the facts on the ground. The choice wasn't a choice, it was just what you do. She paused. And then I'm going to say that the choice that came after, to stay quiet, to not fight the record, that was a real choice, and I made it for understandable reasons that I've spent 6 years living with. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's better than a prepared remark, he said. She almost slept. 3 hours, maybe 4, the light kind that sat on the surface rather than going deep, but enough. She was up at 5:30, dressed by 6, at Holloway's side by 8. The subcommittee room was smaller than she'd imagined. She had pictured something cavernous and television formal, but the actual room was wood-paneled and close, with a long committee table and a witness table facing it, and seats behind for staff and observers. Senator Nakamura was there. She was chairing this session, along with 4 other committee members whose names Olivia had reviewed and whose political motivations Holloway had explained with patient clarity. 2 had veterans and their immediate families. 1 was up for re-election. 1 had been pushing documentation reform for years and genuinely didn't need a political reason. There were reporters in the observer section. Bren Kowalski was there, 2nd row, with a notepad. She caught Olivia's eye when Olivia came in and gave a small nod. Not warm exactly, more like a runner acknowledging someone at the same checkpoint. Holloway had told her what to expect. He had not told her that sitting at the witness table and looking at the faces of 5 United States senators, people with the actual institutional power to change what the record said and what the consequences were, would produce the specific physical sensation of her own heartbeat in her ears. She hadn't expected that. She breathed through it. Senator Nakamura opened the session with a statement about the purpose of the hearing and then looked at Olivia directly. Ms. Mercer, we appreciate your willingness to appear voluntarily. Please take whatever time you need. Olivia pulled the microphone slightly closer. Thank you, she said. I'll try to be straightforward. She was straightforward. She went through it in the order it happened. The mission, the conditions, what she'd found when she reached Ray and Atlas, what she'd done medically and why each decision was made, the specific timeline of her extraction and her separation from the service, and the period between those 2 things when she'd been aware that the official record was being finalized, and had not challenged it. She did not perform emotion. She did not try to be compelling. She gave them the facts in the order they occurred, and she was specific about every detail she could recall with confidence. And she said, "I don't know," 3 times when she didn't know, which Holloway had told her was the most important thing she could do for her credibility. When she reached the part about the notebook, one of the senators, the one who'd been pushing documentation reform, leaned forward. "You wrote this record in September 2018, he said. "At that time, did you believe it would ever be relevant to an official proceeding?" "No," Olivia said. "I wrote it because I needed Ray Dawson's name to exist somewhere in connection to what happened. The official record wasn't going to do it, so I did it myself." A brief silence in the room. "Thank you," the senator said, and sat back. The hardest question came from a senator she hadn't expected, a quiet man from the Midwest who had said very little and who waited until the 4th round of questions to speak. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "you've described the decision not to challenge the record as understandable given your circumstances at the time. I want to ask you something more personal. Do you regret it?" She had not prepared for that one specifically. She sat with it for a moment, in the room with the reporters and the senators and Holloway at her left elbow and Bren Kowalski's notepad in her peripheral vision. "Yes and no," she said. "I regret what the silence cost the Dawson family. That's clean regret. I had information they needed, and I didn't find a way to get it to them. And 6 years is a long time to carry an incomplete story." She paused. "But I don't fully regret the person I became during those 6 years. I lived carefully and quietly, and I paid attention to what I needed to survive, and that's not something to be ashamed of. People do what they can with what they have." Another pause. "What I've learned is that survival and silence aren't the same thing, even when they feel like it. I confused them for a long time." The senator nodded slowly. He didn't write anything down. He just nodded. The formal findings of the IG investigation were released 3 weeks after her testimony, on a Tuesday morning that was overcast in Millhaven, with the first real snow coming down off the mountains in soft, flat pieces that hadn't decided to commit yet. Olivia was at work. She found out from Holloway's text at 7:45. "It's published. Full substantiation. Read when you can. Call me after." She read it on her phone during her break, in the alley on the milk crate, with snow drifting past the edge of the diner's awning. The report was 42 pages. She read the summary and the findings sections, which together ran to 8 pages, and were written in the precise, bloodless language of institutional accountability, which was its own kind of eloquence when what it was describing was what had been done and who had done it. Vincent Aldra. Substantiated finding of intentional falsification of federal personnel records across 14 documented cases, including the deliberate omission of Olivia Mercer's role in the September 2018 extraction mission. Referred to the DoD General Counsel for Criminal Review. His retirement benefits subject to administrative hold pending outcome of criminal referral. Gerald Pratt. Substantiated finding of complicity in documentation modification and failure to report known errors. Cooperation with investigation noted as mitigating factor. Pension review proceeding with an adverse adjustment recommendation. Formal letter of censure entered into his professional record. Olivia Mercer. Service record to be formally amended to reflect accurate personnel documentation for the September 2018 mission. Commendation review initiated. 14 cases. The report named all 14. 12 of the other individuals were identified by initials only at their request. 2 had agreed to be named. Olivia was one of them. She sat on the milk crate and let the snow drift past and read the findings twice, and felt something that wasn't triumph. Triumph was the wrong shape for it. It was more like the feeling of setting down something she'd been carrying for so long that she'd stopped noticing the weight and only understood how heavy it had been once her hands were empty. She went back inside and finished her shift. The criminal referral against Aldra moved through channels over the following months with the slow, grinding patience of federal legal machinery, and Holloway kept her informed at each stage without overwhelming her with detail she didn't need. Aldra did not go quietly. His attorneys filed 3 separate challenges to the referral process. 2 were denied quickly. The third took 11 weeks to resolve and was denied by a panel that issued a written opinion describing the evidence against him as substantial and the documentation fraud as deliberate and systematic. The word systematic appeared 4 times in 6 pages. His attorneys stopped filing challenges after that. The criminal charge, when it was formally filed, was falsification of federal records, a felony. He entered a plea negotiation that his attorneys stretched across 4 months. The final agreement, reached in early spring, included a guilty plea to a reduced charge, a fine that was significant but not ruinous, and a formal prohibition from any future work with federal personnel documentation. His retirement benefits were permanently reduced. It was not prison. Olivia had known it probably wouldn't be. Holloway had been clear about the realistic range of outcomes from the beginning, and she had made her peace with the fact that institutions protected their own in specific ways, even when they were punishing them. What Aldra received was not the maximum consequence, but it was public, it was documented, it was attached to his name in every public record that would outlast him, and it was permanent. The 14-case report had its own separate consequence. An independent review board was established to audit documentation practices across 3 additional operational periods, and 2 other officers were placed under investigation before the year was out. Olivia didn't track those cases closely. She had enough to manage in her own. Gerald Pratt retired on a reduced pension on a Thursday in February, and the censure letter went into his file, and that was the last Olivia heard his name. The commendation review produced a result in March, and Holloway called her at 8 in the morning to tell her about it. She was at Marcus's kitchen table, which had become, over the preceding months, the place she did things that required sitting still and thinking carefully. A shift that had occurred without deliberate decision, the way most actual changes in a life occurred. The review board has recommended a posthumous commendation for Sergeant Raymond Dawson and a service commendation for you, Holloway said. The recommendation is going forward to the Secretary of the Army for final authorization. Olivia set her coffee mug down. How does Sandra feel about the posthumous commendation? She's been notified. She cried on the phone with Dora for about 20 minutes, from what I'm told. She said Ray would have hated the ceremony, but would have pretended he didn't. Something in Olivia's chest moved in a complicated direction. What does my commendation involve? She said. Practically. A formal ceremony if you want one, a notation in your amended record, and a letter from the secretary, which is as official as it gets. A pause. You don't have to do the ceremony. I know. She looked at Bear, who was under the table in his kitchen floor position, chin on his paws. I'll think about the ceremony, but I want Sandra to get Ray's commendation first. Whatever public moment there is, I want it to be about him, not about me. That can be arranged, Holloway said. It was arranged. The commendation ceremony for Ray Dawson happened on a Saturday in April in Ardmore, Oklahoma, at a small ceremony attended by his family, members of his unit who could travel, and a handful of people from the community who had known him before he enlisted. Olivia was there. She sat in the second row, not the front, and she watched Sandra and Macy and Sheila Dawson receive the commendation on Ray's behalf. And she watched Macy, who was 9 now, who did have her father's laugh, who was at the age where she was old enough to understand some of what was happening and young enough to absorb it in a way that would shape her for decades, hold the framed commendation in both hands with a carefulness that was the most dignified thing Olivia had seen in years. Afterward, in the parking lot, Macy came up to her directly. No hesitation, the way children moved when they decided something. You're the one who stayed with my dad, she said. Yes, Olivia said. Macy looked at her for a moment with the specific evaluating gaze of a 9-year-old who was still working out what the adult world was made of. He showed you a picture of me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He did. You were about 2. He said you had his laugh. Macy processed this. I know what my laugh sounds like, she said. I've heard videos of him laughing. We do sound the same. You do, Olivia said. Macy nodded once, apparently satisfied, and went back to her grandmother. Sandra hugged Olivia in the parking lot, briefly and hard, the way people hugged when they'd run out of words and the gesture had to carry the rest. Olivia hugged back. They didn't say anything that wasn't already said. Olivia's own commendation ceremony was smaller, at her request. A private notation event at the Army Liaison Office in Billings, attended by Holloway, Dora Winslow, and Marcus. No reporters. No cameras. The commendation itself was read aloud by a colonel who had a careful respect in his voice that was not performance, and the amended service record was handed to her in a folder that was unremarkable in every physical sense and which she held for a moment before putting it in her bag. Marcus shook her hand afterward. Then he hugged her, which surprised her slightly, because he was not a person who hugged easily, which meant it was genuine. Ray would be glad it was you, he said, that it was you who stayed. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. He would have done the same, she said. I know, that's why. The television segment aired in May. Bren Kowalski's original piece had brought the story to the national veteran community, but the segment reached something wider. The ordinary civilian world that didn't follow military accountability journalism, but watched the evening program on a weeknight and encountered this story between other stories and stayed with it. They filmed at Kettleton Creek, as planned. They filmed the corner booth where Marcus always sat, and the counter and the window where Olivia had watched the black SUV and the alley where she'd sat on the milk crate shaking. Patsy allowed the filming with the particular gracious severity of a woman who had decided this was the right thing and was committing to it completely, and she appeared on camera for 45 seconds and said 3 sentences that were the most precisely accurate description of Olivia that anyone had given on record. She came in here 3 years ago, and I hired her because she showed up on time and didn't ask stupid questions, Patsy said. I didn't know what she'd been through. It wasn't my business. But I'll tell you, people who've been through hard things and come out the other side have a way of working that you can't fake. She has that. She looked directly at the camera. She earned her coffee refills. Olivia, watching the final cut on her laptop in Marcus's kitchen 2 days before it aired, laughed for the first time in what felt like a long time. Real and a little rough, the kind that surprised you. I didn't know she was going to say that, she said. That's Patsy, Marcus said. The segment aired on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the Veterans Legal Defense Consortium reported their highest single-day donation volume in 11 years. By Friday, the Armed Services Subcommittee had received formal requests from veterans in 8 states asking about the documentation audit process. 14 cases had become a number that people in the veteran community were now using not as a statistic, but as a threshold, the point at which the pattern became undeniable, and the question shifted from, did this happen, to how do we make sure it stops? Olivia read the coverage and felt something that she would have once dismissed as too large to be real, but which she was learning to let exist without interrogating it, the knowledge that what she'd done had mattered beyond herself. She gave her notice at the diner in June. It was a Wednesday morning before the breakfast crowd, and she and Patsy were doing the opening setup, and Olivia put down the coffee cups she was carrying and said, I need to tell you something. Patsy looked at her, said nothing. I'm going to leave at the end of July, Olivia said. I've been offered a position with the Veteran Wellness Network in Billings, working with combat veterans and their service animals. Medical consultation and training, ongoing, she paused. It's what I should have been doing for the last 6 years. Patsy was quiet for a moment. Billings, she said. Yes. That's 4 hours. Yes. Patsy picked up the coffee cups and continued setting the counter. You'll need to give me 3 weeks minimum, not 2. 3 weeks, Olivia agreed. And tell Dale Pritchett yourself. He's going to make it dramatic, and I don't have the patience. I'll tell him. Patsy nodded. That was the entirety of it. But when Olivia turned to go back to the prep area, Patsy said, without looking up from the counter, You did good, Mercer. The whole thing. A pause. Not what I'd call graceful, but good. No, Olivia said, not graceful. Most things aren't, Patsy said, and went back to work. The morning she left Mill Haven, she went to the diner before the sun fully came up. Not because it was open, it wasn't, for another hour, but because she wanted to see it in that particular pre-dawn stillness, when the mountains were going from black to gray, and the street was empty, and the diner's sign was off, and it was just a building where she had spent 3 years refilling coffee and surviving. She stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes. The air was cold and clean the way Montana air was always clean, the kind of clean that you didn't appreciate until you'd been somewhere that didn't have it. She thought about what she was and wasn't taking with her. She was taking the notebook, which now lived in a fire safe at Holloway's office in official copy and in her bag in personal copy. She was taking the amended service record, which said who she was and what she'd done, and which would not be changed again. She was taking 37 months of learning that invisibility was a temporary state and not an identity, which was the hardest thing to learn and the one that had taken longest. She was not taking the silence. She was leaving it here, on this sidewalk, in this valley, where it had served its purpose and where she no longer needed it. Marcus's truck pulled up at 6:45. Bear was in the back seat. "Ready?" Marcus said through the window. "I've been ready for longer than I knew," she said, and got in. The Veteran Wellness Network's Billings facility was a converted building on the north side of the city, unremarkable from outside and alive from inside. The controlled, organized movement of people and animals, and the specific, purposeful noise of a place where important things were happening in ordinary ways. Olivia's first day, she was shown to an office that was mostly borrowed space, with a desk and a chair and a window that looked onto the courtyard where the service dog training sessions happened. She stood at the window and watched a session in progress. A dog, a shepherd mix, young and still learning, was being worked through a focus exercise by a trainer. Beside the trainer, a veteran in a wheelchair was watching with the careful attention of someone who was going to be working with this animal and was beginning to understand what that meant. The dog lost focus twice. The trainer corrected, reset, worked through it. The veteran leaned forward slightly. The dog found the behavior and held it. Small thing, important thing. Olivia had been standing at the window for 10 minutes when Bear pressed against her leg. Marcus had brought him for the visit. He was going to drive back to Millhaven today, back to his life there, and they had made no formal arrangement beyond the one they'd always had: honesty, attention, the willingness to show up. She reached down and put her hand on the dog's head. The scar behind his ear, smooth under her fingers, the thing she'd made in the dark that had led everything here. "I know," she said to him quietly. She didn't know exactly what she was answering, but she said it anyway, the way you said things to dogs that you couldn't quite say to people, not because the dogs understood, but because saying them out loud mattered regardless. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into Kettle and Creek Diner 3 years ago with a bag and a lockbox and a notebook full of things she couldn't say, and had found the smallest possible life and had lived inside it with the specific precision of someone who had decided that being seen was too expensive. She thought about what it had cost. Not just the years, but the daily price of it. The lowered eyes, the forgettable tone, the practiced invisibility that had required constant maintenance and had slowly, over time, started to feel like character rather than strategy. She had confused what she was doing with who she was. That was the thing that had been most worth unlearning. The dog in the courtyard was working again, getting it right this time, holding the behavior, the trainer nodding. There was a knock at her office door. "Miss Mercer?" A young woman, early 20s, in the network's staff shirt. "Your first consultation is ready when you are." It's a veteran and his dog. The dog is having some anxiety responses around crowds and loud sounds, and we haven't been able to work out the trigger pattern. Olivia looked at the courtyard one more time, then she turned from the window. "What's the dog's name?" she said. "Ranger." "Okay," Olivia said. "Let's go see Ranger." She picked up her notebook, a new one, same black and white composition style, first page still blank, and walked out into the hallway. Bear stayed in the office, but when she paused at the door, he looked at her with the same calm, dark attention he'd had since the morning he crossed a diner and found her, and she held his gaze for a moment. The way you held the gaze of something that had known you before you knew yourself again. Then she went to work. Not because the past was gone. It wasn't. It was in the record now, documented and official and permanent, and Ray Dawson's name was on a commendation, and Macy Dawson knew her father's laugh, and the 14 cases had become a number that was changing something at the institutional level, and Aldra's name was attached to a guilty plea in a federal document that would outlast every professional relationship he'd ever traded on. Not because everything had been resolved cleanly. It hadn't. There were other officers in the documentation review whose outcomes were still pending. There were other veterans in other cases whose records were still wrong. The machinery of correction was slow and imperfect and required people to push it from the outside because it would not push itself. Not because she was finished grieving Ray, or finished with the specific weight of having been the last person with him, or finished with the complicated truth that survival was not the same as triumph, and being right about what happened didn't undo the fact that it happened. But because this, the dog with the anxiety responses, the veteran who needed his animal to be useful again, the work of taking something that had been through damage and finding out what it was still capable of, this was what she had. This was what she was, not despite the 6 years in Millhaven, or despite the night outside Kandahar, or despite the sealed compartment and the notebook and the crack that had opened when a dog crossed a room and pressed against her leg, and refused to be redirected, because of all of it. The person who could do this work was made from everything that had tried to unmake her, and she had come out the other side not clean or simple or resolved, but real. The specific realness of someone who had been through the thing and was still standing and had finally, at the age of 34, stopped apologizing for taking up space. That was the lesson she had not been able to learn from the outside. The one that only came from inside the sealed compartment, from the dark. From the specific experience of holding something together with inadequate materials when everything said it wasn't possible. You don't find out what you're made of when things go right. You find out when the record says you weren't there, and you know you were, and you write it down anyway. Not because anyone will ever read it, not because it will protect you, not because it will be enough, but because the truth is the truth even when no one is looking. And sometimes, 6 years later, a dog crosses a room. And someone finally looks.